The agenda would be good.
Well, all good? Yep, ready to start.
Good morning everyone, welcome to this very special meeting. I declare the special meeting open. I would like to acknowledge that today we are meeting on the traditional lands of the Gubbi Gubbi people, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Obviously, as everyone knows by now, but for those at home, the special meeting is in regard to the presentation and adoption and implementation of following ministerial approval of the Noosa Plan 2020. I note that everyone is in attendance, no apologies, I think I just said that. Today the purpose of, I've already said that. We have 3 items on the agenda. Item 1 is the Noosa Plan 2020, presented for adoption and implementation following ministerial approval at page 3. I would like to disclose a perceived conflict of interest.
Can you read out what it is?
Yeah. I declare a perceived conflict of interest in this matter as defined in section 175D of the Local Government Act 2009 due to the fact that Young Care, a not-for-profit community organisation of which I am a director, made a submission on the draft Noosa planning scheme in relation to a parcel of land at 32 Viewland Drive, Noosa Heads. As council is not reviewing the submission made as part of the earlier process, nor examining individual parcels of land within the context of the Shire planning scheme, and given that the adoption of a planning scheme is an item of ordinary business under the Local Government Act, I believe that I could be consider this impartial and in the public interest, and request that I remain in the meeting room to participate in this debate and vote on this matter. Thank you.
So councillors, just for information, when the Mayor declares a perceived conflict of interest, automatically in a council meeting the Deputy Mayor then assumes the chair to be able to deal with the issue. So Councillor Wilkie would chair the meeting while these issues are being considered.
Thank you, Mr. CEO.
Just to clarify, because I am also going to declare a similar conflict, I wouldn't be eligible to vote on this matter. Is that correct?
Yeah. For the benefit of those listening, Mr. CEO, could you explain what ordinary business means in this context?
My suggestion would be that I understand there's some other potential conflicts of interest declarations from councillors, so put all of those on the table and then deal with that at that stage.
Do it en masse. Councillor Lawrenson.
I declare a perceived conflict of interest in this matter as defined in section 175D of the Local Government Act 2009, due to the fact that I made a number of submissions on the draft Noosa planning scheme in relation to the issue of short-term accommodation. As Council is not reviewing the submissions made as part of the earlier process, nor is it examining individual parcels of land within the context of the entire planning scheme, and given that the adoption of a planning scheme is an item of ordinary business under the Local Government Act, I believe that I can consider this item impartially and in the public interest, and I request to remain in the meeting room to participate in the debate and vote in this matter.
Councillor Lawrenson. Councillor Stockwell.
Yes, I too would like to declare a perceived conflict of interest in the matter under the Act due to the fact that I made a submission as group leader on behalf of the Noosa Sea Scouts to the draft planning scheme in 2019 in relation to a parcel of land at 11 Mundi Noosa Road, Noosaville. No changes have been made to the draft planning scheme as a result of this submission. I do not currently hold an executive position in the Noosa Sea Scouts. As council is not reviewing the submissions made as part of the earlier process, nor examining individual parcels of land within the context of the entire planning scheme, and given that the adoption of a planning scheme is an item of ordinary business under the Local Government Act, I believe I can consider the matter impartially in the public interest and request to remain in the meeting room to participate in debate and vote on this matter.
Okay. So, Mr. CEO, the description of this is a matter of ordinary business. Could you explain for the benefit of those listening what that means, please?
Sure. Thanks, councillors. I might go a little bit wider than that, given there's a fair bit of public interest in the planning scheme process and how that works. Obviously, conflicts of interest do arise. Councillors live in the community, they're involved in the community, they have friends, neighbours, they're involved in community organisations and so on. What's important in conflict of interest management is that they're identified and declared and then dealt with in an appropriate way. And so I commend the councillors for those today who have identified they have a potential conflict and raising it for consideration. How to deal with it? The meeting today, the special council meeting today, is part of a process to adopt a planning scheme, and it's at the end of that process. The process last year that the council went through was to consider submissions, and it was that point that individual submissions and all the submission process were considered. That is not part of the process today. So although councillors have done the right thing by identifying that they made submissions, that's not under consideration today. The second thing is, and this is what I guess you've asked me in terms of how the Local Government Act deals with what's defined as ordinary business matter. The regulators recognise that councillors, as I said, live and work in the communities, and sometimes in some of the decisions they may have potential conflicts. And I could probably give two examples. One is in the definition, it actually defines the adoption of the budget, which the council did last week. Every councillor, I assume, owns a property, and you're making a decision in a budget process about what rates and charges would apply to all properties across the entire Shire. So what the Act recognises is the adoption of a budget is an ordinary business matter, and the fact that a council might own a property and you're making decisions about what rates are going to be paid is by definition therefore not a conflict, and it's appropriate to be able to make that decision. One of the other definitions in ordinary business matter is the adoption of a planning scheme. So that's the final step in that process where the council adopts a scheme in its entirety. It's not looking at individual submissions or parcels or whatever it might be, it's the adoption of the scheme in its entirety. So certainly the definition in the Act clearly prescribes that it would be appropriate for councillors to recognise that at the adoption stage, councillors can vote on the matter when they have no greater or lesser interest than any other resident would have.
Thank you, Mr. CEO.
CEO, just to clarify, the difference here in something like a budget submission or in elements of planning scheme is that various councillors have actually made submissions towards the planning scheme. I understand we're at the adoption phase and that those elements aren't considered at this point in time. Is that the only difference? Had this been at an earlier stage of the planning scheme debate, would the situation be different?
Yes, it would. In the process, if the council was considering submissions and individual councillors had made a submission, then that councillor wouldn't be protected by the exemption. The exemption provides to the adoption of the scheme, the final adoption. And in fact, in Councillor Stockwell's case, he was a councillor at the time when the council was considering the submissions in relation to the draft scheme. And in that case, he did have a conflict of interest and had to leave the room for consideration of the matter in relation to the Scouts, or Sea Scouts I think it was at the time. But the adoption process is a different process to that submission process.
Thank you, Mr. CEO. In that case, Mr. Chair, I'll move the first resolution. The councillors note the perceived conflict of interest declaration of Councillor Stewart. Resolved that this represents a perceived conflict of interest in this matter, and that Councillor Stewart may remain in the meeting room to participate in the debate and vote on the matter.
Thank you, Councillor Juricevic. We have a seconder, please. I'll second it. All right, Councillor Juricevic, you wish to speak to the motion?
No, thank you, Mr. Chair. I think the questions I've asked the CEO and the explanation he has provided is sufficient for me in the matter.
Thank you. Any other councillors wish to speak to the motion? That can only be Councillor Finzel or Councillor Wegener. No. Jody, wish to close?
No, thank you.
Okay, I put the motion. Those in favour? That's Councillor Wegener, Juricevic, Wilkie. Against? Councillor Finzel, are you?
Are we voting again?
We're voting
They staying in the room.
Councillor Stewart can stay in the room.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. So we'll do it. We'll call that
Sorry.
again. Those in favour of Councillor Stewart remaining in the room? Councillors Wegener, Juricevic, Finzel, and Wilkie. That's unanimous. Next motion is about.
Mr. Chair, I'll do that. Take the initiative again. I'll say that I'll move that the councillors note the perceived conflict of interest in the declaration of Councillor Orriston. Resolve that this represents a perceived conflict of interest in the matter, and that Councillor Orriston may remain in the meeting to participate in the debate and vote on this matter.
I'll second that. You wish to speak further on that?
Only for the same reasons outlined earlier.
Okay. Put the motion. Those in favour? Councillors Wegener, Juricevic, Finzel, and Wilkie. That's unanimous. That's carried. And the final resolution, Your Honour.
And while I'm on a roll, councillors note the perceived conflict of interest declaration of Councillor Stockwell, and resolve that this represents a perceived conflict of interest in this matter, and that Councillor Stockwell may remain in the meeting room to participate in the debate and vote on the matter.
Yeah. I'll second that. Councillor Wilkie.
Again, for the reasons outlined in the two previous circumstances.
Thank you. All in favour? Councillor Wegener, Juricevic, Wilkie. Against? Councillor Finzel, are you voting or not today?
We're voting on when
Sorry, I
Brian can
wasn't
stay in the
paying
room on these.
Okay, Councillor Finzel, we're voting on a similar resolution to the last two about a perceived conflict of interest, and this time it pertains to Councillor Stockwell. So I'll put the motion. We're looking at Councillor resolution that's highlighted there, moved by Councillor Derisovic and seconded by myself, that councillors note the perceived conflict of interest declaration of Councillor Stockwell. Resolved that this represents perceived conflict of interest in the matter, and Councillor Stockwell may remain in the meeting room to participate in the debate on this matter. So I'll put that. Those in favour, Councillor Wegener, Derisovic, Finzel and Wilkie, and that's carried unanimously. Councillor Stewart, it's back to you.
Thank you very much.
I'd like to move the staff recommendations.
Thank you very much.
And I'll second that.
Thank you. Thank you, Councillor Stockwell.
Okay. So, councillors, we're at step 20 out of 20 of the statutory planning scheme review process. There is no step 21. It's either adopt or go back to step 1. If we go back to step 1, we'll have another 2 to 3 years of working with the plan first gazetted in February 2006, and we'll be throwing away over $3 million of ratepayer investment in the planning scheme review. So let's reflect to start with. What's changed since the current scheme was first gazetted? In February 2006, you may have been, like me, one of the 100 million MySpace users. It was bigger than Google around then. But unless you were attending Harvard University, you definitely did not have a Facebook page, because it didn't open up to the general public in Australia until September that year. If you were a really cool businessman or business type, you had a BlackBerry, and that was the first time you could talk on the phone and send messages, and an iPod to listen to your music. But you wouldn't have had an iPhone because they weren't around for a couple of years after that. In 2006, the baddies triumphed over the religious, with the #1 blockbuster, Pirates of the Caribbean Looking for a Dead Man's Chest, grossing twice as much in the box office compared to the acolytes who were trying to unravel the Da Vinci Code in search of the Holy Grail. In 2006, the last VHS movie was made. We've moved on. The world that the current Noosa plan was based on no longer exists. Like the Dead Man's Chest, the current plan is filled with plenty of gems, but it's time for a remake. The Noosa planning scheme for this community is like the Da Vinci Code. It's about searching for the holy grail of what a sustainable future for this community looks like. So since we've kicked off this scheme review process, we've had extensive consultation. We've had detailed deliberations with 6 different stakeholder working groups and to contribute to the GAS scheme. We've gone out to public consultation on 3 separate occasions. We've reached over 34,000 people on social media, and just under half of those, 16,700, have downloaded information about the plan. During the 2 public consultation periods on the draft plan, there were 8 public pop-ups, 850 people had direct face-to-face discussions with staff, 750 phone inquiries were answered, and we responded to 180 emails. That all resulted in a total of 1,540 submissions, which each were individually considered and responded to. So today, we're at the decision. It's important to note that in any democracy, there's a range of voices in the community be heard. And I respect that there are people around this table and elected on the platform that would like to see some elements of the draft scheme changed. But the decision in front of us today is either to adopt or not adopt. Staff and state government officers advise once the Minister's approval was given, there is no opportunity to amend except to satisfy his conditions. So the decision then is about what is the best thing to do for this community from an environmental, social and economic perspective, which will help us respond to the immediate challenges ahead. Which plan best serves the needs of the Shire as we endeavour to navigate our way out of a pandemic-induced recession? Do we adopt a new scheme with its enhanced protections for waterways, wetlands and groundwater dependent ecosystems? Or do we stick with the plan that was conceived when the largest incident in Croy was the closure of a sawmill? Do we adopt a new scheme which has zoned substantial new areas for social and worker housing close to employment hubs to address the significant need for affordable housing in the community? Or do we stick with the plan that predicted, with the high growth rates of the time, that we'd reach the population cap by 2016, where in fact Current projections look more like 2036. Do we adopt a new scheme which facilitates growth in rural and nature-based tourism along the Noosa Country Drive and the Noosa Trails network? Or do we stick with the plan developed when Pomona didn't even have a supermarket? Do we adopt a new scheme which provides more flexibility to interchange business users in centres and reduces the level of assessment for 75 different types of business, making the startup process quicker and less expensive? Or do we stick with the plan that was written when the Shire had about 6 stores where you could rent a video and the Bridge and Digital Hub was still a bowls club? Councils, there's obviously only one answer to all these questions. It's time to adopt the planning scheme. There's one final reason why we should adopt a new plan. It is perhaps for me the most compelling reason. In March, the residents of Noosa Shire had the chance to select their representatives for this place. In the wisdom, they chose 4 councillors who made a public commitment during the campaign to adopt the scheme. While the mayoral vote was close 50-50, 4 out of 6 of us mayor councillors are at least in part sitting here because we made our position clear that we would adopt the plan. This is not saying that all 4 of us agree with every single aspect of the plan. For example, I for one was keen to see more significant protection for the character housing and significant old trees around Old Twatton, Corroy and Pomona, and was convinced to wait for further studies and then if the need for an amendment of the scheme. So the most compelling reason for me is that the people have spoken. In the interest of respecting the democratic process, it is now time to adopt the new Noosa plan.
Thank you, Councillor Stockwell.
Madam Chair, may I speak?
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank
Thank
you.
Councillor.
Thank you. Well, for the benefit of those listening today, the work on this planning scheme began almost 4 years ago, has attracted nearly 2,000 total submissions and cost an estimated $3.2 million to get us this far. It has the approval of the state government and is here for adoption with ministerial conditions, which are standard practice with new planning schemes. As advised, there are no more opportunities for change in state review. As staff have advised, we are finally at step 19 in the 20-step process. We adopt today or we start again from scratch. The current Noosa plan has been in place since 2006 and been amended 9 times. It cannot be amended further. And over the last 14 years, the Noosa community has experienced a period of unprecedented change, which this scheme seeks to accommodate, especially in commercial enterprises, where businesses are now often multi-purpose and may include manufacturing as well as a range of mixed services from the one premise. Through the reduction of red tape, in this case removing the need for material change of use or impact assessable applications in a wide range of businesses, this plan makes establishing a new enterprise much easier and less costly. It also acknowledges and seeks to balance the social and economic impacts, both positive and negative, brought by online accommodation booking platforms for home-based and whole-dwelling short-term accommodation. After undergoing extensive legal checks, the final draft has been approved by the state with conditions, including the amending of fire hazard, erosion hazard, biodiversity and koala habitat overlays to reflect state mapping, providing more detailed planning guidance for the Noosa Business Centre site, changing provisions around social housing to reflect state guidelines. And in a condition that will help improve general understanding, Council will prepare a comprehensive guide explaining the requirements for operating short-term accommodation in Noosa Shire. Council will also undertake a 2-year review of the social and economic impacts of short-term accommodation and produce a report for the Minister on the findings. It's worth noting that the planning scheme's balanced approach to short-term accommodation in low-density residential neighbourhoods is similar to that adopted by at least 9 other Queensland councils, including Sunshine Coast, Gold Coast, Port Douglas and Whitsunday. The positive and negative impacts of short-term accommodation were highlighted in case studies from around Australia and the world in the Council's short-term accommodation and online platform issues paper, the planning responses to online short-term holiday rental platforms by University of Sydney study, which both helped guide this scheme. The aim has been to balance the benefits offered by home-based visitor accommodation experiences while protecting resident amenity and ensuring residential neighbourhoods over time are retained primarily for permanent residents, which is a requirement under the Queensland Planning Act. The reality is that under this new planning scheme, every dwelling in the Shire can host some form of visitor accommodation, be it whole dwelling, or home hosted. There have been claims to the contrary, which is why the Minister's requirement for a comprehensive guides to be publicised is welcome and much needed. But under the new planning scheme, every dwelling in the Shire can host some form of visitor accommodation. Under the new scheme, in the medium density residential, high density residential, residential and rural zones, plus visitor accommodation zones, short-term accommodation will be a consistent use and impact accessible. In the low density residential neighbourhoods, properties that are already being used for short-term accommodation, including all traditional holiday houses, will continue to do so, as they will have existing use rights. Owners of houses in residential neighbourhoods that want to go overseas and short-term let their properties can do so for up to 60 days a year. Property owners in the low-density residential areas that are not currently short-term letting, but may want to, can also apply within the next 12 months for the right to do so under the superseded planning scheme. And homeowners in the low-density residential zone who want to let out 1 or 2 rooms for home-hosted stays will be able to do so without the need for town planning applications, as long as certain conditions are met. To recap, under the new planning scheme, every dwelling in the Shire can host some form of visitor accommodation, be it whole dwelling or home-hosted, and a local law, yet to be implemented, will help regulate behaviour and minimise negative impacts for short-term accommodation. That said, the low-density residential neighbourhoods are to be preserved principally for permanent residents. This was an issue where widespread consensus could not be reached, unfortunately, and some interests who believe Noosa's real estate potential no longer remains unlimited may not rest until all dwellings in the Shire become potentially available for whole house short-term letting by making it a consistent use in the low-density residential zone. But in my view, Noosa is not just an opportunity for those seeking their second, third or fourth investment property for short-term letting. It's first and foremostly a community. It's not just a much-loved visitor destination, it's also a community. I urge colleagues to at least give the current, widely adopted, lawful and balanced approach to short-term accommodation a 2-year trial as mandated by the Minister before considering amendments on this matter. Other local governments across the state have also adopted a similar well-reasoned approach that seeks to balance commercial and community interests on this point. And finally, I'd like to thank the staff who have put in literally thousands and thousands of hours in getting the planning scheme to this point, and to all the residents and businesses who have made submissions on this matter. It's been a long journey, it's been a difficult journey, and if it was an easy undertaking, it would have been done yesterday and finished perfectly. But there is still capacity to amend the scheme after it's adopted, because we know there'll be fine-tuning and no planning scheme is perfect.
Thank you, Councillor Wilkie. Would anyone else like to speak to the motion?
Or move amendments.
Or move amendments?
I would like to move an amendment by adding the following words. And this is concerning the industrial use zones. And I'd like to initiate a process to monitor over a 2-year period the effectiveness of provisions in the Noosa Plan 2020 with regard to industrial land and industry precincts to ensure the provisions meet the objectives of enabling the changing nature of business, including increased diversity in key sectors and provisions for small purpose flexibility in work. Provide a report back to Council on this monitoring program, including any associated recommended amendments to the Noosa Plan.
Call for seconder.
Seconder?
Peter seconder.
Thank you. Councillor Weber.
Well, as you guys remember, some of our most lively discussions have been around the Croy industrial area and the use that out there, and also we have learned that there are numerous inconsistent uses in industrial areas throughout all the different industrial estates through Noosa. And I hope this motion will help guide Council in continuing to make regulation which reflects the needs of our community. The nature of business is continually changing, and I just would like to push that boat of staying on top of these changes and making regulations that reflect the needs of the community more clear.
Thank you, Councillor Wiggins. Would anyone else like to speak to the motion?
Happy to speak to the motion. I think it's a good amendment in terms of, I think when we make new and interesting changes to the scheme, and certainly the level of flexibility in this scheme around the industrial zoning is very new, and it's an approach that was very much looking at the trends we're experiencing around the globe, and the fact that we do have now an enterprise type precinct in the Noosa industrial estate and a makers precinct, and the fact that we actually have a lot more flexibility to small scale manufacturing in our business zones while living above the retail is also a very new way of thinking for the Noosa scheme, and it's one which I think has a great potential to allow us to provide opportunities for smaller businesses by subletting, by the dominant tenant, like we see with one might be for Councillor Wegner. We have is a surfboard maker with 2 or 3 other different types of enterprise in one building. I think that is a very useful model to go on. It's one that I actually went to 2016 election on promising to put into the new scheme, and it's one that I think everyone in the previous council and staff were very keen to pursue. So really working out whether what we have done works over the next 2 years, I think is a really good model, is to monitor and evaluate the first 2 years, and if things are looking at like they're not achieving the objectives we set out to, then by all means that's the time to consider amendments. So I support the amendment.
Yeah, likewise, I support the amendment. I think that, as Councillor Stockwell alluded to, any significant changes that we've made, and that we have made some changes into the industrial area, as Councillor Wegner pointed out, deserve to be monitored and evaluated over a certain period. I think a 2-year period is the appropriate time frame to enable that to happen, to see the changes. Principally because in the first 12 months of any change of a planning scheme, there's an opportunity for an applicant to put an application under the superseded scheme. So to allow that 12 months to pass and to see the impact over the 12-month period of the new scheme wholly and solely in operation, I think is appropriate. And I commend Councillor Wegner for bringing this amendment to us.
I strongly support this amendment because it gives us the opportunity to develop what I call true enterprise precincts that encourages innovation and employment diversity. I think that we've taken the first step in creating an enterprise precinct by allowing the mix of hospitality and industrial uses in the Noosaville industrial area under the Venture Drive Enterprise Precinct. But I think that when you look at Victorian models of enterprise precincts, it's clear that we still have a long way to go. I think this amendment gives us the opportunity to take the next steps, to establish true enterprise precincts that capitalise and embrace exciting opportunities such as distilleries and microbreweries, and support this new emerging economy. So thank you, Tom, for bringing this to the table.
I too support this motion. Thank you, Councillor Wegner. I think it is a good one. I think it provides greater flexibility for our potential economy. I think it diversifies our economy. I think it empowers our community through these enterprise precincts. I think it creates hubs in different areas. Specifically, you mentioned Karoi. I think it's great to have more industry out there. And I think it's also potentially, if we do create these hubs around our shire, it will address some traffic issues. It will take away from our hotspots, Gympie Terrace, Hastings Street, and it will be go-to places for many. So that will address in ways too our issues with transport and parking. Not wholly, but it will contribute towards it. So I commend this amendment and I wholeheartedly support it. Thank you.
Yeah, I endorse the comments of the Mayor, Councillor Lawrenson, Councillor Durisovic and Councillor Stockwell. We want to make sure that we get this right. These precincts are critical to enterprise, and it's only appropriate that after 2 years, there'd be, over the 2-year period, there'd be a appropriate monitoring of new initiatives, and it gives us the opportunity to make sure that we have got the settings right in this case. Thank you.
Councillor Pinson.
Thank you everyone for your comments, and thank you Councillor Wegner for your motion today. I support it. I think it's a great opportunity to test the flexibility of the new Noosa plan to meet changing needs for mixed use industrial spaces, the integration and co-location of a variety of industrial uses to be provided for is a great step towards innovation and a future that encompasses the current needs of industrial spaces as we move towards new industry. Thank you.
Thank you. Would you like to close, Councillor?
You have a right of reply.
Right of reply?
Yeah. No, thank you.
Disagree with anyone.
No.
So we'll put that motion to a vote.
Thank you. Yeah, no,
Quick
good.
while you're ahead.
All in favour of Tom's amendment or Councillor Wegner's amendment? Unanimous. Thank you, Kathy. Would anyone else like to move a further amended motion? Is that me now? Yeah.
Yes, thank you. I would like to move in a motion today.
Amendment.
To monitor over the next 2 years the effectiveness of the provisions of the Noosa Plan 2020 in enabling the delivery of housing choice and affordability to meet the diverse needs of the community. Specifically housing for those in our community on low incomes with special needs or in identified groups of need of community and affordable housing, and provide a report back to Council on this monitoring program, including any associated recommended amendments to the Noosa Plan to strengthen the provisions towards these outcomes.
I'll happily second that.
Thank you. Councillor
Or
Pinson.
do I speak
Yes.
to that now? Okay. So one of the conditions of approval by the Minister was to amend the provisions Council had in the new Noosa Plan regarding social and community housing to be achieved as our two major centres. This small housing right in the centres close to shops, work, transport. The intent was to achieve housing for our key workers, young people, people on low incomes or special needs. Council has taken a strategic approach to these requirements, providing substantial uplift across these sites, and was considered a good community outcome and reasonable to require community housing outcomes as part of these major developments. Council will continue to pursue these outcomes for its community, and the plan will continue to play an important part in achieving more affordable and diverse housing for our community. This is vital and important as we head towards a future where no one is left behind. We will continue to work with the state government to advocate for support for affordable and community housing for our community, and monitor how this progresses over the coming couple of years. I think it's really important that as we talk about a plan that heads towards a future, that we have to be fully inclusive of those who are different or who are not, who have needs that need to be identified and measured. Gandhi states the true measure of any society can be found in how it treats its most vulnerable members. Moving forward, I would like to see that this Shire is innovative, progressive and contemporary in meeting the needs of those who are less fortunate than some of those of us who can access the best things in life. So today I can really call upon this council to please consider my motion in one way that we lose no one along the way. We can measure and monitor the effectiveness of this plan in meeting the needs of all of us in this community. Thank you.
As a council, we have an obligation to ensure that local residents are able to access a range of diverse housing options based on their needs. Affordable housing strategies and their implementations need to be locally driven. We should not just leave this to the state. We need to undertake our own housing market analysis and use this data to create strategies for action to facilitate more affordable housing for our community. This is our opportunity under the town plan to facilitate and promote this outcome. I fully support your motion, Carrie.
Thank you. Thank you. Would anyone else like to speak to this motion, Councillor Stock?
Oh, look. I always thought it was going to be me who would quote Gandhi in this case.
CEO doesn't offer enough.
Now it's Nelson Mandela.
One of the first planning studies done for this planning scheme was a housing needs assessment, and there's no doubt that while diversification of the economy is important, provision of housing that meets the needs of our population is equally important. The scheme has a raft of initiatives to provide incentives for private investment in affordable housing. It gives inducements for small housing to fit the needs of our ever shrinking household size. But councillors, one of the biggest disappointments, the absolute shattering realisation that even though it went through the first state interest check without anyone raising an issue, is that in the condition 5 of the Minister's approval, he required us to remove a requirement for 2 sites which this council specifically gave a significant upzoning to. At the coal site at Noosa Junction, very close to the employment hubs of the junction, and Hastings Street, where we put an area into high density residential, and at the Noosa Civic, another employment hub, where we put a vast area into high density residential, where we said that extra development potential we're giving those people who own that land should be offset by a requirement to provide a percentage of social housing. We want it to be a requirement, and while we really thank all the hard work by the state government and the minister to work with us on this planning scheme, I'm afraid the Queensland government needs to hang its head in shame. The next 2 years, if we see the continuation of the current trends in this recession, the provision of social housing is going to be a big priority for governments across Australia and the world. What this motion does is allow us to track to see whether the private market will prove me wrong and suggest that the minister's requirement just for us to encourage the provision of social housing actually works. But if it doesn't, we may have to look at other mechanisms. There are other mechanisms that we're currently looking at, which is looking at whether there's council-owned land that may be suitable for social housing. But this one is important because council can't hope to be a social housing provider. We have to build in the community ethic of making part of all our new development suitable for our age, suitable for our young workers, and suitable for people with special needs in housing, so they're integrated into the community and we all look after each other. So well done on the amendment. I totally support it.
I too support the amendment, and I share Councillor Stockwell's bitter disappointment at the fact that the Minister saw fit to remove a provision for social needs housing in those 2 areas of greater facilitation of high density residential, being at the Shire Business Centre and at the Noosa Junction, I've forgotten the word, Noosa Junction Centre anyway, the business centre. Thank you. It is a shame, but I commend Councillor Finzel on her approach here with regards to managing and monitoring of social needs housing in our as a result of the change to the introduction of the new planning scheme. The affordable housing document that we initiated showed us that there was a distinct need for affordable housing in the region, and of course through the COVID environment, one of the things that seems to be hitting the news headlines this week in particular is the need for social needs housing, and that opportunity for not only economic stimulus through for the building industry, but the need to accommodate those most in need within our community. So I commend Councillor Finzel on this amendment, and I look forward to the review over the next couple of years. Of course, this isn't the first time that council has tried to instigate provisions into the planning scheme to provide for social needs housing or housing for the working community, as we've done in the past. But I hope and they haven't necessarily succeeded. So I think the need to go back and review and see the effectiveness of those measures that we put in is vital.
Thank you, Councillor Finzel. I too support it. Those words, advocate for affordable and community housing, well, they took on new meaning for me yesterday when I attended United Synergies. And I walked around that incredible resource that we have available in our community, and I spoke to them about the people who are homeless, who come and have showers, about the children in our community who are sleeping in their cars and who are coming there. And that's not acceptable. That is not acceptable. We are doing so much, but there is so much more that we can do. Affordable housing is mandatory, and we must fight the good fight and get it through. We must help those who can't help themselves, and I wholly support this. I would just like to finish with a quote. If we're talking about Gandhi, the best way to find yourself is to lose yourself in the service of others. As roles of leaders, we are in a role of not only leadership, but we are in a role of service. And this is a great indication and a great area where we can provide and fight for that service. Thank you.
Thank you.
Councillor Finzel, thank you for bringing this motion and for your rousing speech. You have raised an issue that's dear to our hearts and dear to all of our hearts. And as you've heard, we did make efforts through the draft planning scheme to include social housing in 2 key sites. But although certain departments in the government, we understand, were fully in favour of it, the final decision was contrary to what we had hoped for. I fully support your idea of monitoring over 2 years. 2 years is a good, sufficient period of time to gather sufficient data to make some meaningful decisions about how we're tracking in that regard. And it's consistent with what we're going to be doing for the industrial estate and also short-term accommodation as mandated by the Minister. So thank you for bringing this, and I fully support your amendment.
Thank you. Councillor Williams, I beg your pardon.
Just quickly, congratulations, Councillor Finzel.
Thank you.
We've been quoting Gandhi, and of course, another person who you wouldn't expect who would have supported this motion is Adam Smith, because Adam Smith actually said that the very important role of a capitalist society is to look after the elderly and the most vulnerable.
Well done.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Councillor Finzel, would you like a right of reply?
What do I say?
You don't have to.
I'd just like to thank all the staff at this time too for their hard work and how you've committed yourselves over the last 4 years to deliver this plan. So thank you. And I'd like to thank everyone's support today.
Thank you. We might put that vote to a motion. All in favour? Motion to a vote. Unanimous. Amendment. Yeah. All in favour?
Yes.
Yes. Unanimous. Thank you. Are there any more amendments to Councillor?
I'd like to make an amendment to the town plan to include F, initiate a process for amending the Noosa Plan 2020 under section 18 of the Planning Act 2016 that reviews the levels of assessment and associated provisions for short-term accommodation in the low-density residential zone, specifically considering the inclusion of the use of short-term accommodation as a consistent use in the low-density residential zone, where consisting of no more than one dwelling. I first want to start... Oh,
you've got a second. There's a second. I mean, incomplete.
Oh, and sorry, G. I'd also like to move an amendment to complete and introduce a local law for short-term letting, including the associated code of conduct to regulate short-term letting.
I'll second that motion.
I want to first start by just correcting Councillor Stockwell. Today in front of us, we actually have 3 choices, not 2 choices. First choice is to adopt the new plan. Second choice is not to adopt the Noosa plan and start the plan preparation process all over again. And our third choice is the choice that I'm putting to Council today, which is adopt the new Noosa plan and initiate amendments to the plan. One of the reasons that I ran for Council was because of the short-term accommodation debate. I'm going to refer to that as STA. Changes in the Noosa town plan around STA regulations created great debate and massive divide in the community. I was approached to help fix the divide and bring clarity and perspective to this debate. I was approached to represent a large group of people in this community who were not being heard. According to my numbers at the election booth, that was 10,600 residents who were not being heard, or nearly 40% of the people that voted at the March election. My research has also revealed some real data. Council data shows that from the 1st of January 2014 until the end of January 2020, that is over the last 5 years, Council received only 32 formal written complaints an average of 5 complaints per annum about noise from short-term accommodation. To give you all a bit of perspective, during the last 12 months, Council also received 508 complaints about dogs barking. Council decided to change legislation to appease 5 people out of 55,000 residents. I am here because 40% of Noosa voters were outraged by this decision. We all made commitments to listen to the community. Well, now is your chance to listen to some real data. What I believe makes things worse is that the solution to the imaginary problem did not involve, in my opinion, proper or effective consultation. In my opinion, the community was bombarded with a scare campaign about the evils of short-term accommodation. Thankfully, the community did not believe the hysteria and decided to vote me in council. How can we, as responsible councillors, change the town plan to please only 5 people in a town of 55,000 people and at the same time angering 10,600 people? The right thing to do is to go back to the original proposal that made STA consistent, impact accessible in low density residential zones. Unfortunately, this is not what is being proposed today. What is proposed is to divide the community even further by saying those of you with existing use have rights to STA and the owners of properties next door to you do not. It's absurd that we would discriminate amongst our own community. Not only is it denying residents equal rights, it's unfair, undemocratic, and it's actually considered illegal. May I quote to you a statement from Bill Potts, the ex-president of the Queensland Law Society, quote, that the planning amendments will be unenforceable with the risk of significant litigation against council in the community's interest. In his opinion, regarding STA regulation, council has no other option than to start again. According to Bill Potts, these changes were, quote, a discriminatory assault on the rights of property owners and could skew values. Not only does he consider that these changes should be illegal, but in February 2020, Cameron Dick's office, the state government, sent the town plan back to council and by way of condition number 8, told us what 10,600 residents already knew, that the plan in regards to short-term accommodation needed further work. Not just further work, it needed further consultation because the potential impact of these significant changes were in fact significant. Councillors, we changed the town plan because of 5 formal written complaints. Using this logic, with the 508 dog complaints, we should have banned dogs in Noosa years ago. I'm asking you all to do the right thing today, not to approve the plan because the STA regulations that were made at the last minute by Councillor Stockwell in September 2019 were unfair. And Councillor Jaruzovic, your vote against Councillor Stockwell's motion is noted. I'm asking you to approve the plan and initiate immediate amendments to provisions relating to STAs and complete and introduce a local law and a strict code of conduct for everyone, residents, permanent renters and STA providers. Because if this plan is approved, all of our promises of listening to the community will be broken. The words, your say, your Noosa, will be just that, words. We have an opportunity today to get things right, to show the community that we're listening, and this is in fact your Noosa.
Thank you, Councillor.
I have
Councillor
a
Stockwell.
question of the Director of Planning. A number of statements that I need clarification on. Firstly, there was an opinion by the head of the ex-head of a legal professional association, Bill Potts. Have you ever heard of Mr. Potts' name used in the Planning Environment Court? Is he a Planning Environment Court lawyer to your knowledge?
Sorry, that's not up to the Director to identify what basis that person has. That's an unfair question.
So I'll ask a general question. If a councillor is seeking legal advice on a planning scheme, would it be appropriate for that person to ask either a professional planner or a lawyer who is active within the Planning Environment Court. Is that the best place to go for information?
Yes, it is. In fact, through this whole process, council sought advice from our solicitor, who specialises in town planning and environment, the Planning and Environment Court, and we've also sought advice from Queensland's leading QC in the Planning and Environment jurisdiction.
And on that advice, are you, Mr. CEO, happy that there is nothing illegal about the planning scheme as is proposed to be adopted today?
Yeah, sure. We obviously have the scheme reviewed by our lawyers. We wouldn't be putting the scheme forward as staff if we believed there was anything unlawful about that scheme.
I ask a question also. We've had an extraordinary statement that if this scheme was introduced, particularly the provisions pertaining to short-term accommodation, then it would be illegal. Was there any feedback from the Minister's office that suggests that this scheme was illegal? These provisions are illegal.
I can answer that. The short answer to that is no. If the Minister, I understand they don't do a legal review per se, they're looking at the planning issues, but the legality of the scheme is not raised with us in the conditions associated with the approval of the scheme.
And just to further on from that, were there any other comments in relation to the provisions around short-term letting that we got from the Minister's office other than the condition within the responses?
The Minister and Planning Department signed off on the scheme. As part of signing off on the scheme, they provide written advice that the scheme complies with all state regulation, legislation and the Planning Act. So from that perspective, no, there wasn't any concern from the Planning Department about its compliance with the legislation. As councillors know, over the last couple of years in the development of this scheme, there's been a whole lot of toing and froing around this issue. It's been one of the most complex and potentially controversial issues that the planning schemes had to deal with. It's a land use. Noosa's always had short-term accommodation, holiday letting, but nothing like what's occurred in the last couple of years. So, like every other land use in our community and in our shire, the planning scheme needs to deal with that. We had lots of conversations and lots of toing and froing between the state departments and us about this issue. But at the end of the day, the Minister signed off on the scheme and provided a condition that said this attracted the most interest, this issue, in your planning scheme. Hundreds of submissions that we responded to, hundreds of submissions influenced this the approach that was put to council. Well beyond 5 complaints, I need to say, hundreds of submissions, hundreds of conversations. No doubt it was divided. Lots of people supporting, lots of people against. Ultimately, we needed to balance up all of those issues around what was an appropriate use in the low density zone, which its primary purpose is for permanent living. Ultimately, that's what we recommended to council and what council adopted. So at the end of the day, the Minister signed off on that, provided a condition to say because of the heightened nature of it and the community interest, we strongly suggest you monitor it. We had conversations with them about that and agreed and said absolutely, it is absolutely something we will be monitoring. It's a key aspect of the scheme and we should do that. So we're absolutely happy to comply with that condition.
Go back to the claim of illegality. There are at least 9 other councils across Queensland that have a similar approach to short-term accommodation. We're making it inconsistent and impact accessible in the low-density residential zone. Has there been any feedback from those councils about problems about any so-called illegality associated with that approach to short-term accommodation?
No, not that we're aware of, Councillor Wilkie. We definitely had conversations with other councils. We looked at what other local governments were doing, both here in Queensland and in other states, particularly Victoria, because they're also in places like Mornington Peninsula, dealing with the same sort. Lots of tourist towns are dealing with the same sort of challenges. But no, we haven't received particular advice or been advised that there was any concerns about the legality of their approaches.
Probably answer that. There's no legal challenges that I'm aware against those other schemes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. There's also an opinion expressed that the consultation process was somehow flawed. Has there been, in the signing off of this scheme at the state level, has there been any views expressed by the Minister's office that the consultation surrounding the scheme was anything but appropriate?
No, there hasn't. I was going to say quite the opposite, but it's been acknowledged that the scheme met all its requirements around consultation, and actually went over and above the minimum standard for consultation, both in terms of the timeframes that we had the planning scheme out for consultation, 3 rounds, not just 1, and the methods that we used for consultation. So the final approval from the Minister acknowledged complete compliance from that perspective.
Thank you. Further question, if I may, Madam Chair. Yeah. A statement was made that in the low density residential areas, properties that have existing use rights for short-term accommodation, there may be a neighbouring property that currently does not have that use right, and that is discriminatory. Is it true that once this planning scheme is adopted, that neighbour that doesn't currently have short-term accommodation rights can make an application under the superseded planning scheme for those rights to run a short-term accommodation?
Yes, there's a provision in the Planning Act that, and I think Councillor Jurusevich might have mentioned it, that allows when a council adopts a new planning scheme, there's a 12-month provision where anyone can seek to exercise a right or a use under a previous scheme for 12 months. It's called a superseded planning scheme application. And that is open for 12 months. So essentially we have a new scheme that may make some changes. If those changes result in a potential loss of right or a change of use on a particular property, that landowner can actually seek to have their application assessed under the superseded scheme for a period of 12 months.
Just clarify that relates to all changes under the scheme. We're not just talking about short term. So any particular change under this scheme that is different, any material difference between the new scheme and the scheme we currently have, that same provision applies.
Thank you.
So
It's colloquially known as the use it or lose it provision, so 12 months.
So just to clarify, for the first 12 months, an applicant can put in an application under the superseded scheme or under the new Noosa plan, depending on, I guess, their needs or their desires for their property.
Yeah, that's correct. There's a little bit of nuance to it. If you were seeking to apply to have your application assessed under the superseded scheme, you need to make a specific request. I'd like my application assessed under the superseded scheme for these reasons. Our planning department then needs to assess that and make a recommendation as to whether or not the application will be considered under the superseded scheme or should be considered under the new scheme. They'll advise the applicant, and then the applicant makes the application under whatever scheme.
So that's true, even if the use was consistent under the old scheme.
That's correct.
What were the timeframes and the costs associated with that?
So the process, I'm going to look at Kerry here. The process for a superseded scheme application, we have a 30-day timeframe to make a decision on a superseded scheme application. And there is a fee associated with that.
$1,380.
Good on you, Joe. Councillor Jurusevich, at $1,380 for that process.
Thank you.
Yeah, if I may. I understand that the Minister has, well, as we've discussed and as in the report, the Minister's mandated a review of short-term accommodation provisions up to 2 years. Could you talk about the requirements for its comprehensiveness and its rigour, and it being evidence-based, and I understand also that any amendments to be considered have to be considered after consideration of this report. Can you talk to about the evidence gathering process that the council would go through under these conditions mandated by the Minister, please, before we would consider amendments?
What a review would require.
Yeah.
Sure, Councillor Wilkie. Yes, the Minister, is one of the 8 conditions, has required Council to monitor the short stay provisions for the reasons I talked about previously, and being very specific in the comprehensive and evidence-based nature, and the sorts of things that they are requiring council to consider, very much reflecting the range of issues that came up through the consultation and the preparation of the plan process, both by those who've supported it and not supported it. So the ministers required us to do an analysis of what our current situation is in terms of numbers and uses of short-term accommodation, which we now have done. The analysis should look at annual comparison and how that data might change based on the new planning scheme provisions. It should consider the economic and social benefits of the current situation and look at the potential long-term benefits and impacts of short-term accommodation across the residential zones. It should consider the zone intent, so I talked about the purpose of the zone previously, levels of assessment and regulation for short-term accommodation across the residential zones. Consider state interest in housing supply and diversity and tourism. Be evidence-driven, comprehensive and prepared in a detailed manner. Once we do that process, we're then to submit a report on the findings of that monitoring process and provide all of that information to the Minister, and provide a statement as to whether or not Council considers the planning scheme should be amended based on that information.
Thank you.
I'm also assuming that one of the things that we would monitor is the number of applications that we would get under that superseded scheme to see what the level of desire to continue short-term letting in the low-density residential zone would be over that period.
Yeah, absolutely. We can absolutely track numbers of applications, and we would do that.
Would anyone like to speak to the motion, or does anyone have any further questions?
Yes, I do.
You've got a question?
Anyone else?
Do you have a question?
Okay, so firstly, thank you, Amelia, for your speech today. It covered a lot of important points. As we're all aware, the short-term letting debate has been a divisive issue in this community. The Queensland Government is committed to ensuring council decisions are made against a backdrop of openness and transparency. In Queensland, there is a legislative requirement that all local governments implement a complaints management process to improve their accountability and to resolve complaints, including those about administrative actions of local government. The reason I bring that to the table today is to just put that out there for people in community, whichever way the decision goes today. There is always a mechanism or a process by which we can have things amended or changed or work better towards a future where we are constantly working harder, longer, stronger to provide an equitable society that gives everyone a voice at the table. I have questions regarding this amendment with regards to provision for short-term accommodation in the low-density residential loan.
Sorry, Councillor Finzer, just to stop you. Is this part of your... Are you speaking to the motion, or...
Do I ask
that
questions now about the amendment or not?
You can continue speaking to the motion, but you can ask questions later.
Oh, okay. All right. So, I don't know what else to say then. So with the associated costs involved, I stand on the ground today for the most vulnerable again in our society. The highest homelessness rate these days is for women over 55. A lot of women that I worked with in the workspace are over that age group, and they use short-term accommodation in their homes to be able to meet the affordability and requirements of their mortgage as they age. If we support the provisions for the short-term accommodation in the low-density residential zone, considering the inclusion of the short-term accommodation as consistent, as put forward by Amelia Lawrenson today, we come back to giving provision to those people who may not have the fee of $1,380 to apply under the new planning scheme. And there should be provision for these people to not end up as one of the statistics on the street because their home is no longer being able to bring them the income without the costs associated under the new plan. If there is a way that that could be resolved, I would be most appreciative to hear about that. Moving forward today, I'd like to think that we could work together to provide good and clear outcomes for our community regarding this matter.
Thank you,
Question, please. Just to clarify, there seemed to be a misunderstanding. The 1,300 application fee is only for whole house application. A property owner in the low density zone could, without even a town planning application, let out a couple of rooms to provide the sort of accommodation that Councillor Finzel was referring to under the provisions proposed before us today. Is that correct? Could you perhaps create some clarity around this misunderstanding, please?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Councillor Wilkie. That is correct. So the new plan actually makes it a lot easier than the current planning scheme for people in that exact situation to rent out parts of their house or their rooms for short stay accommodation, to home hosted, to supplement, you know, their income and to support them. So the new plan actually makes it easier. The Councillor Wilkie's correct. The reference to short-term accommodation in the low-density residential zone is for whole houses where the property owner does not live there. They're either investment properties or they're full holiday houses. That's the use that is proposed in this final scheme, in the draft scheme, that is considered inconsistent in the low density residential zone.
The other provision that is allowed in there, as I understand it also, is that a whole house can be rented out for holiday letting, i.e. up to 60 days over in the period of the year, also without having to submit an application. That's a consistent use. Is that correct?
That's correct, Councillor Jeruzovic. So the new scheme allows for anyone to use their home. For instance, if they're going away for a couple of weeks over Christmas, to rent it out for short stay, going, you know, away, want to, you know, capitalise on the Noosa Try weekend where town's busy, and rent their property. So anyone can do that for up to 60 days a year, 4 times a year in the new plan.
And just to clarify, as that's a consistent use, there'd be no fee associated with that either?
That's correct.
Thank you.
So for that 4 times a year, up to 60 days, just to clarify, it's if I rented out 4 weekends a year, that's my 8 days, isn't it? That's it, 4 times, no more.
It's 4 times, up to 60 days.
Would anyone else like to speak to this motion?
Yeah, look, I'll speak to the amendment. I think the kindest thing I could say about it is that it seems to be duplicating what the Minister is already mandating in terms of a review, the gathering of comprehensive, rigorous and evidence-based data about the impact of short-term accommodation, and a report including any proposed amendments for consideration by the Minister and also by this Council. That is the correct process. It's a fair process, it's an open process, it's a transparent process. So if there are concerns that the impacts of these short-term accommodation measures are not going to be properly monitored, I think we can put that to rest. Like the review of the industrial estate, the social housing, short-term accommodation is a pivotal issue. I do acknowledge that. As Councillor Lawrenson said, it was a prime issue during the election campaign, but I think the proper process before amendments are considered, rather than just cutting to the chase and going straight to amendments, is that we gather all this data first, as mandated by the Minister, in an open, fair, transparent, comprehensive and rigorous way, so the Minister and this Council can make an informed decision. It's also, as revealed by questioning, statements that said that that inferred that these provisions are in some way illegal. That is absolutely false and wrong. And also any statements that inferred that these changes to address short-term accommodation, which is a worldwide phenomenon, it's happening in communities around Australia and the world, as we've seen in the reports that helped inform the planning scheme, are not just driven by a handful of complaints. It's about managing a new type of land use. And we certainly don't take any step like this lightly. It's not, and we're not changing legislation. But we're trying to catch up and introduce legislation for the first time. So, councillors, I won't be supporting this Part J of this amendment, but I do see value in Part K, which is the complete and introduce a local law for short-term letting, including the associated code of conduct to regulate short-term letting. I understand that's where we're heading already, but perhaps there needs to be more questioning around what that may involve. So if I can finish my speech with a question, are staff comfortable
Sorry,
with...
we might just check that everyone's comfortable.
Oh, yes.
With the media. Is everyone comfortable with the television? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
So my question would be,
Councillor.
would staff be comfortable with Part K of this amendment? And does it encapsulate adequately where we're heading with the local law?
Thanks, Councillor Wilkie. Yes, I think staff would be comfortable with Part K of this amendment. As you might recall, with the last round of the consultation on the Noosa plan, Council also put out a draft local law for short-term letting to look at a range of sort of management issues around short-term properties. That local law also received hundreds of submissions, really comprehensive submissions from both individuals, property owners, short stay let property owners, resort owners, consultants. So some incredible feedback on that. At the time, we were also advised that the state government were pursuing a statewide approach to a potential local law, statewide approach and code of conduct. So our local law was sort of put on hold, because if there was a statewide approach, then great, that's the way we should go and be involved in that. And council was actually represented on that state ministerial advisory committee on the short stay statewide code of conduct. So it was essentially sort of put on hold to see where that went. But we absolutely would be comfortable with pursuing finalising the local law. There's a lot of information we need to work through. It's likely that will result in changes to the draft local law, and that we would reconsult on that. But that's a process that we can go through.
I have a question. Councillor Wilkie stated that this is not dissimilar to the requirements by the state. It's my understanding that this is to enter into immediately, whereas state is a process of waiting 2 years.
Yeah, that's correct. My understanding of this amendment is that we would start a process of an amendment process to the plan immediately, not waiting the 2 years. Obviously, when you amend a planning scheme, it needs to be based on information. So there would be a range of information that we would have to gather and draft an amendment and provide to the state government. So there is some information that needs to underpin any amendment process.
Thanks, Kim. And I imagine we would already have a lot of that data on file, wouldn't we, based on so much research undertaken in this area?
Yeah, like I said before, there are aspects of the minister's condition that we've already started to work on, and over the last 12, 18 months, our knowledge around the quantum of short-term letting in the shires increased substantially. So yes, there is a basis of information that we do have.
Thank you.
But to go to the heart of what the minister's condition requires is that we start to gather information about the impacts of short-term accommodation provisions once it's been implemented. We don't have that data at the moment because it's not implemented. Is that correct?
Sure, that's absolutely correct. So the minister's condition is twofold. It's understand your current situation, which we do. We've gathered that data. We know the quantum of, we know where short-term letting properties are. We know the nature of them, whether it's a room, a whole house, those sorts of things. So that's one aspect of it. The second aspect is, if your scheme is adopted, monitor the impact of the provisions of your scheme from a range of things I talked about previously. So yes, there are two aspects to it that go to the heart of both your questions.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to speak to this motion? Councillor Stockwell.
Yeah, I will. I'm going to start off with a opening proposition is you can't vote for the last amendment and say the things that you said in the last amendment and support this one. It is just a total contradiction in terms. And I'll do that by debunking a range of misinformation that was provided in support of this motion. It was serious misinformation. Some of them have been raised before and reviewed by a retired judge, and they also highlighted that some of the statements made were inaccurate and incorrect. There is no illegality. That was a very, very serious claim to be made, which needs to be questioned further. To quote a criminal defence lawyer on a planning matter, to try and substantiate your case, I'm afraid, is a serious.
I might stop you there. I'd like some clarification.
Excuse me, is there a point of order?
Yeah, there is a point of order.
What is the point of order, please?
The point of order is that you've raised something that Councillor Lauriston has stated, and she said she never did. So I'd just like clarification from her.
So, can I ask the CEO, is suggesting that I may have said something that's inaccurate, is that a point of order under the standing orders?
No, it's not.
I'd just like clarification of
Madam Chair, regarding the point of order, they can't be raised if you disagree with what you're hearing.
Yeah.
And there's opportunity for clarification through questioning later. May I suggest that?
And I will, if I have misquoted, I will retract the statement. I will say again, it is serious to make an imputation by quoting others who are unqualified to make comment of illegality. As I said, I've done a look at Mr. Potts's, I believe it's the same one that I've read, and I found that he was a criminal defence lawyer with no mention in any of his write-ups having anything to do with planning law. I think it also is really serious to suggest, even if flippantly, that the scheme amendments were made as a result of 5 out of 5, 55,000 people. My argument on this issue has always been the most compelling case to stop what was a raging growth industry of whole house acquisitions to convert residential areas close to tourism areas into tourism areas, was that its effect on housing prices and the subsequent effect on the affordability for workers to rent in an area. It's not just my concern. The fact that the Airbnb phenomenon across the world has had this effect in places like Noosa is really well established. That the Australian Housing and Urban Research Unit, the University of Tasmania, the University of Sydney, Southern Cross University, University of Queensland, McGill University, University of Massachusetts Boston, University of Victoria in Canada, all suggest, their research says, that by doing what is proposed to make short stay accommodation a acceptable use in low density residential, is that it reduces the availability and increases the price of permanent rental accommodation and places upward pressure on housing prices. There's also evidence given to the Commission of Inquiry in New South Wales which identified that frequently available Airbnb homes amount to 167% of the rental vacancy rate, the proportion of rentals available for local households to rent any one time in central Sydney, and nearly 4 times the number of rental vacancies in high demand suburbs surrounding beaches. In Byron, there are around 50 holiday rental vacancies for every permanent rental available for local residents. Now, I think the world's changed. I think the pre-COVID world, where we did see this huge upswing and we did see the conflict, and we saw places like Barcelona and other areas in Spain where people took to the streets, that's gone because COVID has changed the nature of the world. As I said, social housing and providing affordable accommodation for our workers and for people over 50 are where we should be focusing on. So, councils, what this motion does is suggest we're adopting it, but we don't really want to adopt it, we're going to change it straight away. I don't support that notion. If it had said exactly the same what Councillor Wegner's amendment had said, or Councillor Fizdale's amendment had said, which is we're going to look at it for a couple of years and see whether we need to change it. We've already highlighted for the next 12 months, anyone who feels aggrieved by it can come and say, I want to do short-term accommodation. Now, there is an argument that short-term accommodation in the high value suburbs around Noosa Heads, Noosa Sound, are not going to be affected by the social housing or the upswing in prices, and I agree. They've got 12 months to apply. If they feel aggrieved by what's changing and they want to do short-term accommodation, anyone in the low density residential zone can apply and have that considered. And it's most likely that if they're in an area where a lot of the streets already converted to short-term accommodation, that they might be successful. We can't preempt, but in reality, what will probably happen is all those concerns can be addressed simply by putting in a superseded planning scheme, and all those people who feel aggrieved by the fairness argument can get their rights preserved. As well as, of course, anyone who's already doing it can retain those rights under existing use right provisions. I think it is really important to say that yes, some of the issues are about local amenity, and the local law was meant to address those. And I'm happy if a future amendment comes up to look at reaffirming our intent to proceed down that line. I also think it's important to understand, while yes, I appreciate that there is competing views in the community about this, and yes, I have no doubt that Councillor Lawrenson was elected based on her strong advocacy in this regard, and I think it's important that she has a voice to say those things. But in reality, the choice was clear. 4 of us, other than the Mayor, were clearly identified as supporting the adoption of the planning scheme as it is. 49,000 votes were cast for those 4, just under 21,000 for those who didn't make that commitment. I think, once again, if we honour democracy and we honour the voice of the people, then we don't support this amendment. If we value social housing and we want to create suburbs for people to live in at the best possible price, we don't support this amendment.
Would anyone else like to talk to this amendment?
Yep.
Look, I appreciate it. I think Councillor Stockwell alluded that there are differing opinions around the table and differing opinions in our community, but it's some of those seem to not fully understand the opportunities within the new planning scheme to provide home hosted stays and or short-term lets, holiday lets for, as has been the go in Noosa for many, many years. The challenge with regard to short-term lets is that element of whole of house and in the low density residential zone. And as Councillor Lawrenson alluded to, look, I had challenges when we went through this initially through council. I still have challenges now. There's a lot to get your head around. This isn't an easy issue to get your head around, because there are so many differing views around the neighbourhood. But trying to please every element of our community on every element within this planning scheme is impossible. The opportunity for amendments and further considerations of issues through amendments, as per the last planning scheme that underwent 9 amendments, is here. But I think I'm challenged by point J, but I support point K. I think point K has, and I'll speak to each of those elements that Councillor Lawrenson has provided here in the amendment. There is, as has been alluded to by the previous 2 amendments, another choice in the way we deal with matters. We can either approve this planning scheme, we can reject this planning scheme going forward, or we can, as we've alluded to in the last 2 amendments, monitor the benefits or impacts, as the Minister's conditions has given us a clear requirement to do for 2 years, before moving into an amendment process. And I think that's the appropriate way to undertake a process of trying to make amendments in the scheme. We haven't even seen the impacts of these. For the next 12 months, there will be potentially no impact, because people will still be able to apply under the superseded scheme. So it'll take that 2nd year before we actually see whether that impact occurs. And of course, as Councillor Stockwell has alluded to, we're in a post-COVID-19 world. The world has changed. The impact of all of those people that were trying to do those short-term lets through this period of shutdown has meant many of them have had to go and review the way that they do things. many of them may not come back to the short-term letting arrangement. We may see no more of these properties in some areas. The market forces that determine where short-term letting is and isn't effective hasn't been given an opportunity to see what impact it will have in a post-COVID world. 32 formal written complaints, 5 said. I'm not going to go to those figures because I receive correspondence on a regular basis regarding the impacts of short-term accommodation on our residents that are out there. The element that is missing within the planning scheme at this point is the point that comes up in point K. It's to complete and introduce a local law for short-term letting, including the associated code of conduct to regulate short-term letting. I believe that once that's introduced, that will give us the greatest understanding and the greatest bearing on the impacts of short-term letting within our community. And I wait to see the impacts of that local law being introduced before and hold judgment until I see that as to how effective all of this has been. Airbnb has certainly been a phenomenon that has come on that has given people the impetus to jump into this short-term letting market, where we've been a short-term letting society for a long, long time here. But again, I think principally under the holiday letting. And it has certainly had an impact on housing affordability. The irony for me is that one of the last motion amendments that we moved was exactly about that point, about housing affordability. We know that the impact of short-term letting over this period has diminished the opportunity for long-term rental accommodation for those workers that do work in our region. So this isn't something that's going to go away. This isn't something that we need to move on quickly. It's something that we need to take a considered approach on, and we need to monitor the impacts of that we've done. I think the first 12 months we will see how many more properties are likely to be slated into that short-term letting field. If we get inundated with requests or applications for short-term letting, it'll give us an indication as to whether there's still people that want to go into this field. I'm of a mind at the moment that I don't think we'll see that. Again, I said, as Councillor Stocker alluded to, the Minister's condition gives us the need and the requirement to monitor this for 2 years and to review it at that point in time. And I think that's the appropriate way to go. So, like the other two amendments that give that 2-year time period, I think that's much more appropriate. So I won't be supporting this amendment, but I would support an amendment that follows the lines of the Minister's conditions that asks for this review and this process to be undertaken over that 2-year period.
Thank you. Thank you. The new Noosa town plan. Perhaps you should add, in the new Noosa. You see, where we find ourselves today is not where we were yesterday. Our world has changed. Our lives have changed. Australia has changed, and our Shire has changed. It is a scenario that no one could have or would have expected. The economy worldwide is failing. Over $200 billion have been borrowed by our own federal government to keep the Australian economy afloat, to keep our workers afloat, to keep us afloat. As a Shire heavily reliant upon tourism, we are hurting more than ever. Over 4,500 people in our Shire are on JobKeeper, one of, if not the greatest percentages in Queensland. We have no idea about the real ramifications and pain until that gravy train dries up. As a council, we have spoken religiously about supporting our workers, our economy, and our tourism industry. We have sharpened the pencil to the very stub, and we have cut costs to ensure we reduce our rates. To acknowledge that our Shire is hurting, our people are suffering, to do anything we can to show support. We have just brought down a budget which puts our community and our people first. The Noosa Plan 2020, which is before us today, has many good attributes. And I would like to acknowledge all the hard work and dedication that staff have put in to get it where it is today. I would also like to acknowledge their diligence in adhering to the requirements and conditions set down by the state government. I do acknowledge that our town needs clarity and decisions have to be made. The amended motion put forward today is one which I support. I do not support short-term accommodation deemed inconsistent in low-density residential zones. It should, however, be subject to local laws, including an associated code of conduct, which this motion supports. I will come back to that. The new Noosa plan was instigated back in 2016.
The preparation of the draft Noosa plan was undertaken in accordance with the requirements of the Queensland Planning Act 2016. The draft new Noosa plan was open firstly for public input and consultation between February 2019 and May 2019. Council staff brought to the special meeting on the 12th of September 2019 that short-term accommodation in low residential areas be deemed consistent and impact accessible. During that meeting, an amendment was made to make it inconsistent use in low-density residential zones. That amendment succeeded. At a further council meeting on the 11th of December 2019, council confirmed the change of consistent to inconsistent. This was after subsequent consultation from the community between September 2019 and November 2019. The impact of changing consistent to inconsistent use in low-density residential areas on our economy in our shire cannot be underestimated. The zoning laws deemed inconsistent have, in my opinion, the potential to impact house prices. Investors will be less likely to invest in houses in low-density residential areas, and thus there will be less demand in this area for housing. Investors in turn could seek to look elsewhere, in the medium to high density residential where it is deemed consistent to have short stay letting, providing better financial return. This has the potential impact of creating a somewhat distorted market. Added to that, in the medium to high density residential areas, we are driving up prices because demand is increasing, ensuring for many of our residents who reside in unit or duplex style accommodation increased costs. Areas where we need it to be affordable are potentially becoming unaffordable. Affordable housing is an issue for us all. We have just unanimously supported a motion about that very matter. Tourism may suffer. As less stock is available to attract our tourists, there is significant chance that they will choose to look elsewhere for their holidays, robbing us of the ever important tourism dollar. We have seen in recent months the devastating effect on our town when we can't have visitors. Tourist accommodation, short-term letting, short-stay accommodation are a juggernaut in themselves. Hundreds of millions of dollars per year into our economy, our shire. The impact of reducing this stock cannot, in my opinion, be underestimated. Fewer jobs for our workers, our gardeners, our cleaners, our handyman, our admin staff, our hospitality industry, our hairdressers, our retail shops. It's a flow-on effect and so many may suffer. Potential legal implications with existing use rights has been flagged. Limiting short-term rentals in low density also creates vacancies. Vacant houses with the inability to rent out at the owner's discretion, a ghost town. Walk down the streets of Kensington or Belgravia in London and feel that very same impact on a town. That is no community. When our people need it most, in my opinion, we are providing increased barriers. Barriers to affordable housing, barriers to jobs, and barriers to tourism. Most concerning is that no economic impact assessment has been undertaken. We have no data, no facts upon how this change will affect our economy. The state has acknowledged in one of their conditions that this is significant and has imposed a 2-year monitoring process, including the requirement of data analysis to consider the economic and social benefits of the situation and forecast the potential long-term impacts of short-term accommodation across residential zones, housing supply, diversity and tourism. 2 years. We need to enter into something now. Our community needs it now. The motion put before us is a good one and I support it. We must be able to have the opportunity to engage in amending the plan once adopted to enter into a review to consider the return of inconsistent to consistent use in low-density residential areas. It can't, however, be carte blanche. I hear the owners, the accommodation providers, the operators, the tourism sector and the businesses, yet I hear our residents too. I hear the people who suffer because they live next door to a party house. Their needs must not be forgotten and need to be addressed. That is why implementing a local law for short-term letting, including an associated code of conduct, is a must-do. We must have measures, laws and benchmarks in place to protect our community. That is non-negotiable. Never before have we as a council been more obligated to stand up for our economy, our jobs, our employment. If the issue of short-term accommodation was a standalone question, we must ask ourselves, in light of the circumstances we face,
of the community we represent which are hurting, would we support the motion of consistent to inconsistent? Would we gamble with the uncertainty of not having achieved or undertaken an economic impact assessment? The bow has broken and the cradle has fallen. COVID is well and truly here. Never before has it been more important that we relax restrictions, not seek to impose them. We must include this amendment in the adoption of the Noosa Plan 2020. Thank you.
Question, if I may. The Mayor alluded to a diminishing stock of short-term accommodation. Is there anything in the plan as it currently stands going forward that retrospectively degrades the existing use rights of people that have that are undertaking short-term accommodation for a whole property at this stage?
No, there's not. If people have been short-term letting their properties, they've got existing use rights. A new plan does not take away existing use rights. In fact, some of the work that we did looked at the moment, about 50% of all properties are used for short-term, or could be used for short-term letting. So no, there's nothing in the plan that would extinguish or diminish that.
And further to that, I believe some work has been done to try and gather further information on the number of properties that are currently short-term let. Do we know how many properties are short-term let across the Shire, and whether they are permanently let, or let for the entire year, or let for only part of the year?
Yes, we do. I just can't recall those figures.
It's around the 6,000 mark. We don't know whether they're let for the whole year. We don't have that data, but we know that they're available for short-term letting.
Thank you.
There's been some concern raised about the availability of short-term letting or visitor accommodation in the Shire. And for the benefit of those who came in late, does the new planning scheme allow for every dwelling in the Shire to be used for some sort of visitor accommodation?
Yes, it does. The new scheme actually allows for, makes it a lot easier than the current scheme does, for anyone to use their property for short-term letting. As I mentioned previously, if people want to go away for Christmas and let out their property, they can do that. If they want to capitalise on, the Noosa Try weekend, where the town's full, they can rent their property out for short-term letting. Absolutely. So the new plan does that, makes it a lot easier. And it also makes it a lot easier to home host. So anyone can home host, rent out a room or two for Airbnb or visitors. That can also happen. The new plan makes that easier than the current plan.
Okay, so you're saying under the draft planning scheme if we adopt it today, it'll actually make it easier for houses that aren't currently home hosting to be able to do that. There won't be a planning application required.
Yeah, that's right. As I said, the new plan, at the moment, there's an application requirement to home host, for instance. The new plan makes it self-accessible. You don't require an application for that. So yes, there is a freeing up and making it easier.
And just to finally get a full understanding of who is impacted in this, medium density and high density residential areas are still consistent and able to be short-term let?
Yes, that's correct. It's only the low density residential zone, which is of all the residential zones, is the zone that its primary purpose is for permanent living with minimal interruption of visitors. That's the purpose of the zone. So that's the only zone that has it inconsistent for short-term letting of a whole house.
Thank you.
You can still short-term let part of your property, you can still home host in those. And if you've been doing it, you have existing use rights.
Thank you.
Kim, do you think some of the, in regard to the low density, that the local laws and the code of conduct would address the problems with what some of the complaints that you've received?
Yeah, absolutely, I do. That was its intention, to absolutely look at some of those sort of management impacts. So the planning scheme regulates the use. The intention of the short stay letting local law was to manage some of those those impacts, particularly where properties may not be managed. You know, many properties have property managers managing those issues and very successfully, but some properties don't. You know, you turn up to a property and there's a key box on and there's no one. The only person that goes to that property is maybe the cleaner. It's those sort of properties that tend to have the impacts. But like I said, many of the short stay properties are very well managed and don't. But the intention of that local law was exactly to do what you said.
And if it was deemed consistent in low density residential, surely those local laws, which aren't currently in place at the moment, and that code of conduct would address some of those issues and the livability in those neighbourhood precincts.
Like I said, yes, the short stay letting local law was intended to manage some of those things. The challenge is that there's a fundamental conflict with the use in a low density residential zone. The low density residential zone is the only zone that is predominantly for permanent living. So on balance, the operation of a whole house for short stay letting, which operates as could change over every 3 to 5 days, a mini hotel, a commercial operation in the low density residential zone is in conflict with the purpose of the zone.
Can I ask why Council in 2016 at that special meeting brought to the table that short-term accommodation low residential be deemed consistent and impact accessible, and then it was changed by councillors in an amended motion? So initially you brought it to the table as deeming it consistent.
Yeah, look, there's no doubt that over the last 12 to 18 months, Council has looked at a range of ways to manage this issue. We started with short stay overlay. Yeah. You know, maybe there's an overlay that allocated areas that were traditionally used for short stay, and that would be a way that those inside it were consistent, those outside were consistent. So we were definitely looking at ways to try and manage this emerging issue, that this phenomena that was growing rapidly, and the planning scheme and policy was trying to keep up with it. So we were testing a range of options. So the position on this has evolved, absolutely. From that, the short stay overlay to consistent. What we found in the last round of consultation was a huge number of submissions, many for, many against. Lots of the ones against were pro forma, hundreds of them were pro forma around sort of similar issues. The ones that wanted to, I guess the hundreds of residents that told us personal stories around the impacts of short stay letting in the low density residential zone. These are traditional residential neighbourhoods. That's what the purpose of the zone is, tends to be, where people were kept up all night. We had the experience of the local doctor at the emergency at the hospital saying, I'm working emergency all night. I've got a short stay next to me. It's a problem. I can't sleep. So there was a range of issues that were very compelling and took us back to the kind of primary purpose and principles of a planning scheme, which is about managing land use and making sure that the zones, uses that happen in zones are appropriate to those zones, like we do in the industrial estate. We make sure there isn't residential development in the industrial estate, other than caretaking, appropriate caretaking. It's about that. It was about managing that conflict and coming back to the core purpose of the low density residential zone. Yeah,
thanks. I understand that. Just to confirm though, that after consultation with the public from February 19 to May 19, the recommendation that was brought by council, and I know how council are very thorough in their recommendations, it was to deem short-term accommodation consistent, wasn't it? After that consultation, that initial consultation, that 3-month consultation period. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks, Kim. Tom, you're the only person who hasn't spoken to us.
I've got some questions also.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Questions in reference to number of Airbnbs. Kim, I think you made reference, I think it's Guard B&B that collating all our data. 6,000 properties so far are listed as Airbnb, is that correct? I think.
Yeah, Anita's the expert on this, so I do defer to her.
That's what you just mentioned.
We are using a range of data sources. So yes,
B&B Guard,
B&B Guard, that's it.
One source.
Yep.
Okay.
And they're looking specifically at some of those platforms like Airbnb, Stays, that don't advertise addresses.
Okay.
And then I've been doing extra research in terms of identifying them through real estate agents and booking agents and a range of other methods as well. Okay. So collectively that's 6,000.
6,000, okay. So given that every household had 2.5 people, those 6,000 properties that short-term let represent actually about 12,000 residents that short-term let in the Shire. Would you agree with that, Anita?
You just want to repeat the question?
Yeah.
Might be one better for Kim, actually.
Okay, the numbers you've given are that 6,000, there are 6,000 properties that are listed as short-term rentals. Given that each property represents 2 people in a household, we're saying that there's 12,000 residents that are impacted by short-term rentals. Is that correct?
No, they're investors largely.
They're
so
investors.
They're not principal place of residence because these are properties that are 100% entirely let for short-term letting. So there is no resident.
Oh, okay. So these
these
are investors only.
Well, I'm assuming it could be a second holiday investor.
Okay.
But there's no resident on site because it's 100% let for short-term.
Thank you. Also, in relation to medium zoned residential areas, so the new Noosa plan actually now moves short-term accommodation into medium zones. Is that correct, Kim?
No, it doesn't move it into medium density. What the difference between the medium and high density is that it's a consistent use. It's not an inconsistent use. We've got a history, I guess, of medium and high density zones being able to be used for both visitor and residential, and so that continues to do that. It's only the low density zone that
also among the other zones it's consistent.
Oh, so it's also consistent in the tourist accommodation zone, the rural residential zone, the rural zone. So yeah, all of the other zones. The only zone it's inconsistent is the low density residential zone.
So an example of a medium density zone, Noosa Hill, is that an example?
There
are a couple of streets in Noosa Hill that might be medium density. There's in Noosa Hill, there's a large area of medium density which already has well-established resorts scattered right through it, and holiday units scattered right through it. There's medium density in Toronto. There's medium density along the coastal communities. Many also there already have resorts scattered through it.
Okay, so medium density zones are areas where a lot of our workers find rentals, affordable rentals. Would you agree with that?
I think so it's kind of hard to answer that. I think there's rental properties right throughout the Shire. So that does happen throughout all the zones. Depending on who's looking for the type of housing, whether it's a family, a young person, share housing. Medium density zones do tend to have a mix of all types of dwellings. So as Rowena had said, there's resorts and traditional tourist accommodation already in the medium density zone. There's dwelling houses in the medium density zone. There's apartments, there's townhouses. It's the zone that probably tends to have more of the mix of all the types of dwellings. So yes, potentially, but I couldn't categorically say that's the zone where all the renting occurs.
I'd probably just add to that, the other experience that we've seen over the years is that the further you get away from the coast, the more affordable housing becomes, and therefore you tend to have more workers living further away. That's the other element where they tend to live.
Kim, putting on your economic impact assessment hat and your economic hat now, it would assume, would I be correct in saying, as an investor, by creating an inconsistent and consistent use in different zones, that the more attractive as an investor would potentially be the medium to high density because it has more flexibility in regard to the short-term letting? Would you suggest that's correct?
I think, sorry, do you want to just say that again?
Yeah, sure. So if you're an investor and you're looking to invest in a short-term letting accommodation or holiday accommodation and you want to rent it out, is it more attractive with the zoning to be in the medium to high density because that has the consistent use rather than purchasing, say, a house in a low density residential?
I'll probably answer that because I've looked at this before. I think the answer to that is yes, if you're buying based on the range of uses, but no, depending on the location. A location normally trumps every use in terms of the value and what happens to value. But in terms of the range of uses, people generally try and buy a property that has a broader range, gives them more options for the future. But location normally trumps use.
The question is maximising in turn returns for investors the prime purpose of consideration in introducing a new planning scheme?
Sorry, I think you might have misunderstood. I was alluding to the fact that affordable housing was being taken out of the market because investors actually, for that very reason, were going to invest in medium to high density. Therefore, the affordable housing...
Point of order. A question was asked and a debate the question was asked and a debate of the point. I would like to hear the question answered. It's not appropriate to debate a question.
Well, I'm happy for the Mayor to qualify after I've received my answer, if that's if that's all right.
Yep.
Yeah.
So the primary purpose of a planning scheme is to manage and guide land use and development for a shire. There are a range of things that need to be balanced in preparing a planning scheme. We look at every lot in the shire. We consider all state planning policy. We consider all our own strategic work, our social plan, our economic plan, our environment plan. There's 30 technical studies that influence the plan. So there's a range of things that a planning scheme seeks to have to balance and achieve. But you know, at the end of the day, the core purpose of a planning scheme, it's a legal document that is to guide land use and development for a shire, so that people can make applications, our planners can assess against a robust planning framework, and ultimately council can use it as a decision-making framework. It's not the purpose of a planning scheme to consider individuals' investment potential. That's not its core purpose.
Thank you. That actually wasn't. I was alluding to the fact, and I think Councillor Wilkie understands that the fact that if we look at this, where we put more demand in an area, it raises prices, and that, would you suggest, Kim, would have a potential of impact of raising prices in the areas where potentially our people who need affordable housing in our shire reside, therefore making that accommodation more expensive for them?
Look, yes, potentially, but I think there's a range of things that influence the cost of housing and housing affordability and supply. So yes, a planning scheme can influence the market, can absolutely influence. It does. So yeah, potentially what you're saying absolutely could occur. But equally, a planning scheme also manages uses and what's appropriate, and has to have at its heart the community and its residential population. I guess there's a range of what I would say is yes, I think you're right for that aspect, but it's not the only consideration. There are a range of factors around housing affordability, supply, and availability. The planning scheme is just one of them.
Thank you. Does anyone have any further questions before Councillor Wegner takes the floor?
Okay, yeah, I just wanted to talk to the motion.
Please do. No one else has any questions? Yeah. Councillor Wegner, it's all yours.
Okay.
Thanks, Kim.
I'm going to put my surfer hat back on here and just talk about the reality of a person's experience coming to Noosa. And myself, there's a lot of my friends have come here penniless. I did not come here penniless. I had $600 to my name. A lot of my friends didn't. Like Tim Crabtree, who now manages the Land and Sea Brewery, Parrish Watts, and who's in a lot of the lifeguards. And when this group of people, when young people come here, we're looking for long-term rentals, and we're looking for affordable long-term rentals. And we're looking at it very different from investors. We depend on that. And this last few years, a lot of the people that came in my situation live in vans. They live in vans all over the place. And if had the Noosa Council really cracked down on all, and a lot of my friends that live in vans and so forth, and really scramble around, much harder than it was before. And I looked at it, running for council, and saw that it just appears that there's a relationship between Airbnbs and the houses where the newcomers used to live, that the Airbnb has pushed out a lot of those people, that the space that us new people coming to Noosa, and we're the upcoming residents, the new residents that make Noosa the incredible place that it is today. And so that's the way I see it. Now I look at Byron Bay, and it's very different from Noosa. However, my friends that did live, you wouldn't move to Byron Bay as a young entrepreneur right now and think that you're going to live anywhere near the ocean. You'd live way, way, way back. And I think that the rental market there, my friends have told me, my studies have said, have been absolutely changed by the short-term letting. And so I think in the interest of the long-term community building in Noosa and attracting the young people that are vibrant, thriving, coming here to make a better lives for themselves, that in general, that we'd like to stick with the way it is. I don't support the motion on that basis, because it just seems to me that low density housing is where people like me who came and lived there for relatively cheap for a long time before buying a house and becoming a more permanent part of the community.
Thank you. Councillor Austin, right of reply.
Firstly, I want to address some statements made by Councillor Wilkie and Councillor Stockwell. I've been misquoted, and I take serious offence to that. Nowhere in my speech did I say that what was being proposed was illegal. I referred to legal opinion, and I said it was considered illegal by the ex-president of the Queensland Law Society. I also might like to remind you that the opinion, that the legal advice given by council was also legal opinion, and advice that, by the way, was never provided to the community. Councillor Stockwell, you also made reference to the ex-president of the Queensland Law Society not being an authority on planning and environment. Okay, I'm going to quote you instead, Andrew Davison. Before I move on, planning and law expert Andrew Davison, who for the last 22 years has exclusively practiced as a planning and environment lawyer. He and another gentleman called Mr. Lester Manning, who provided legal advice to council before the December council meeting. Now, let me just give you a little bit of an update on Mr. Lester Manning. He's had 25 years of legal experience and represents many councils around Queensland as part of his practice. Now, let me quote you Mr. Lester Manning, because clearly you don't like the advice or the opinion of Mr. Bill Potts. Mr. Manning says, council is not in a position to simply remove the existing use rights of property owners in the low density residential zone through a planning instrument change without potential consequence, quote unquote. This is legal opinion, and we all know that legal opinion, we all have one. I have a legal opinion also. In relation to superseded acts, which has been discussed here at the table, at a council workshop a few days ago, we were given an example of people that could successfully make an application through a superseded act. Areas that we were told at the council workshop that would be more likely to get an approval were areas like Noosa Sound, Noosa Heads, Sunshine Beach. We were also told that areas like Tewantin, someone making an application for existing use rights under a superseded plan were less likely to get an approval. So although this is on the table for the entire Shire, clearly not everyone's going to get the approval. It's still up to council consideration. So now that we have some facts on the table, I want to move on with my right of reply. We all came here on the same platform to listen to the community. This new council have made it their mantra. Councillors We need a planning scheme that's built on fairness and equity. So I ask you to approve the town plan and initiate immediate amendments to provisions relating to STAs and complete and introduce a local law and a mandatory strict code of conduct. Let's allow all properties, not just a select few, the opportunity to use their property as they wish, subject to a criteria set by our town plan and subject to a mandatory strict code of conduct. Why should one property have more rights than another? The answer is they shouldn't. Every ratepayer in Noosa should be allowed to have equal rights, including the 10,600 people who gave me a mandate to stand here before you and tell you that council's decisions to make low residential zones inconsistent was wrong. We simply cannot ignore these residents, and I certainly will not. If this plan is approved, all our promises to listening to the community will be broken. The words, your Noosa, your say, will be just that, words. We have an opportunity today to get things right, to show the community that we are in fact listening, and this is in fact your Noosa.
Thank you. Would you like to vote on the motion? All in favour of Councillor Lawrence's amendment? All in favour? Are you in favour of your own motion? Sorry. Okay, all right. 3. All not. Okay. Against? 4. Motion voted down. 4-3. How about we have
Can I move an amendment?
We'll be able to do that. I think Councillor Wilkie may be calling for a toilet break.
We might have a 10-minute break, everyone. Yeah. We'll adjourn it. Yes, thank you. Welcome back, everyone. Look, before we proceed, would anyone like to make any further amendments?
I'd like to move an amendment to complete and introduce a local law for short-term letting, including the associated code of conduct to regulate short-term letting.
Happy to second that.
Thank you. Thank you, Councillor Lawrence.
I think enough has been said. Thank you.
Okay. Would anyone else like to speak to this motion?
Look, I'll support it. I think it's a very good amendment. The council is heading down this track already, as we've heard from the Director of Environment and Planning. Work on this local law is underway currently, but it's well worth articulating today the council's intention to also introduce this local law.
Thank you, Councillor.
Yes, I'll also support the motion. I think the amendment has great merit. I think this is the one component of that the planning scheme doesn't facilitate in the way of the management of short-term letting, and I think the local law, whilst it's a work in progress, is nearing completion. I'd like to see the completion of it, and I believe that this will also add to the elements of monitoring that we have to undertake with regards to the impacts of short-term letting going forward.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Denzel.
Thank you, Councillor Lawrenson. I think this is a positive amendment moving forward. I've had a lot of the community reach out to me with these exact questions around the impacts of social behaviour, increased alcoholism, noise complaints, etc., waste management issues. I think this is a great step moving forward to give a really robust underpinning to the new Noosa 2020 plan. Thank you.
Councillor Stockwell.
Yep, as indicated, I actually support this process. It does actually change Council's last resolution, which was to really wait and see until what's happening at the state level. But the current conditions and the upcoming election means that there won't be any movement that we can see on this at the state level. So it is appropriate, and I really appreciate that councillors, while we have different views in our terms of the zoning, that everyone here is mindful and wishes to set in place processes that would look after the residential amenity issues associated with short-term letting. And I think this is to once again give staff a really strong indication that we want to proceed on this basis. There were many submissions to this when it went out for consultation, and there is a range of different issues to be addressed. I think it's really important that we continue on to give everyone who may have concerns about what their residential amenity to be addressed through a local law.
Thank you. Councillor Wigan?
No, nothing.
I too support this motion. I think it's very important. It will provide regulations for our residents who have faced problems and concerns regarding this. So yes, I too support this motion. All in favour?
No,
sorry.
reply.
Oh, right, reply. Beg your pardon. Sorry.
Can I just ask a question?
Yes.
Oh, just for clarification, is the state doing any work around these laws?
Brett, you might want to comment too. My understanding is that there was a ministerial advisory group formed, and the mayor has been appointed to that. But I believe we've received some advice to say that I think it's on hold at the moment.
Yeah, I can probably add to it. So the state has set up an advisory group to have a look at this issue of a statewide code of conduct. They did a fair bit of work in 2019. And they were sort of working through that process. I think really that came to shuddering halt like everything else around March this year.
Yeah.
And there hasn't been too much more movement. When we looked at doing the councillor appointments back after the new council came in, we indicated that the former mayor had been on that working group, and we indicated to the state that the council would like Claire Stewart to be on the new group. We've got advice back saying that look, that hasn't really gone anywhere. If they look at reactivating that, they'll get in touch. But at this stage, as far as I'm aware, it's really in abeyance to some extent. They may bring it up again at some stage, I just don't know.
Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
Right, we might vote on this motion. Right of reply, beg your pardon. You're fine, yes, okay. All in favour? Unanimous, thank you. That brings us back to the original motion that Councillor Stockwell moved. Councillor Stockwell has spoken to the motion, as has Councillor Wilkie. Would anyone else like to talk to the original motion on page 3 of our agenda?
Councillor Weinstein.
Given the importance of the new plan, the overwhelming negative response from the community and the strict conditions imposed by the Queensland State Government on the plan's approval, I cannot approve the plan. We have under-tourism and families are going broke. This was an opportunity for Council to help community and, more importantly, to deliver on their promise to listen.
As alluded to through the election process, I did give an assurance that I would support the plan as it stands. Whether I agreed with every element of it or not is irrelevant. That's the assurance I gave to the community, and I'll stand by that. The significance of supporting this document going forward is cannot be overemphasised. I mean, you know, I think Councillor Stockman alluded to it in his speech. $3 million investment, 4 years worth of work, countless public consultations and all the like. Again, I reiterate that trying to please everybody with every element of this is an impossible task. But processes are in place to review and monitor the elements that are the most challenging to within our community. And I'm sure that through these processes we'll get to an outcome in the future to look at amending those elements that are most challenging. But I commend staff for their diligence and their time and effort in producing this document. I commend our community for their engagement and their involvement in this process over that long period of 4 years. I said, I think at the last meeting, I never want to go through a planning scheme again, and I reiterate those comments because it's a lot of work. It's a hard slog, and again, it's a difficult thing to try and have every element that addresses every issue that every member of our community has to their satisfaction. But again, thank you to the staff, to all the staff associated with the planning team and planning scheme. I think your work in this is commendable.
Thank you. Councillor Kinsey.
Oh, sure, why not? Yes, I'd like to reiterate and acknowledge the work that's been put into this Noosa 2020 plan over the period of, 4 years. And at the cost of around $3 to $4 million, and we acknowledge that today. Good governance sits at the epicentre of the decisions we have to make today. And I want to reiterate that my statement earlier was that the true measure of any society can be found in how it treats its most vulnerable. And I do hope that sitting at the heart of our decisions today sits empathy alongside our budget that we worked hard to deliver to community, understanding the impacts of COVID and the resilience that we offer through our governance to drive us forward to a future that is full of hope, innovation, where the social, economic and environmental impacts and needs of this community are valued as we move forward. Thank you.
Again, I'd like to reiterate my thanks to the staff for all their hard work over many years, hours and hours with a small team of 12, I believe. So thank you very much, and thank you for adhering so diligently to the state conditions as well, especially within the timeframes given. That was no easy feat. Look, I don't support the town plan. It is with a heavy heart that I say that. And the reason is because of the change from the consistent to inconsistent. As I reiterated in my statement, I do think it will have significant effect on our economy. No economic impact assessment has been undertaken. I believe that it will create a skewered market, that less people, investors, will attend for the low density. And I don't care about the investor, but I care about the person who's living in that medium to high density in the affordable housing area where those prices may be driven up. It is those people that I care about. Tourism may suffer. We've all seen the impacts of what a town impacted or with no visitors can do. There are so many people in our shire and our community that rely upon work for short-term letting accommodation. I've said it before, I'll say it again, our gardeners, our cleaners, our admin staff, our hospitality industry, our handymen, our hairdressers. It is really a big part of our community. We are a tourist town. And finally, if people have houses and they can't rent them out, or they're limited to when they're renting it out, they create vacant houses. And that is no community. When you walk down a street and they are vacant, there is no community. That is a ghost town, and that is something that I wouldn't like to see become commonplace here in Noosa. I'll say it again, the economic impact assessment has not been undertaken, and that for me is an absolute deal breaker. So unfortunately, I do not support the town plan going forward based on that, those reasons. Thank you.
Just a question. For the benefits of those at home, we're actually dealing with a motion which has been amended. So just to clarify, what we're actually asked to approve here is the original motion with amendments. The original motion contained provisions to reduce red tape, 75 pieces of red tape to make easier for businesses to start up and get going, and as well as allowing every dwelling house in the Shire to be given over to short-term some sort of visitor accommodation, but also initiating a process over a 2-year period.
So is this a question?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, right.
It is
Just
point of
going to
order.
ask the same question.
Okay, just it's the original motion plus these amendments, which include monitoring over a 2-year period the effectiveness of the provisions in regard to industrial land.
Have we got a question there, Frank?
And also monitoring, monitoring the effectiveness of housing choice. And so these are all part of the one motion now. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. The original motion moved by Councillor Stockwell was effectively for the adoption of the planning scheme. There's been 3 amendments made to that. The first related to the provisions of the scheme in relation to industrial land and monitoring that. That was the amendment moved by Councillor Wegner. The second was the amendment moved by Councillor Finzel, which related to, I'll call it the affordable housing provisions and monitoring that for a 2-year period. And the third amendment was the amendment moved by Councillor Lauriston in relation to following through on the local law provision for short stay accommodation. So all of those amendments, those 3 amendments were passed, and they now form part of the motion that the council is considering for the adoption of the planning scheme.
Thank you.
Thank you for clarifying.
Anyone else like to speak to the motion before it is voted upon? And Councillor Stockwell has right of reply.
Just quickly, this is in local government, with democracy, we encode the will of the people, and the people through the government enforce the regulations that we impose upon ourselves. On the campaign trail, I've heard a lot of people saying, look, we want a level playing field. I don't want to be treated special, for example, in the industrial areas. We just don't want other people to get an advantage. And so there was a perception that there was a lumpy playing field where there's a lot of special, a lot of people having different, what should I say, with the laws, getting exceptions to the laws here, there, and everywhere, creating a bit of a lumpy playing field. And I'm so happy that this playing field will be a lot less lumpy now, and we are moving towards a direction of a really good level playing field, which is good governance.
Thank you, Councillor Stockwell. Right of reply.
Thanks. So it's really interesting. Where my mind's got to is that the difference that's been expressed today boils down to a couple of different views about the economic impact of the scheme settings as they are now, and a couple of different views about how you handle the issue of fairness and equity. And no doubt that relates both to the platforms we were elected on and also our own world views. And I particularly appreciated Councillor Wegner's contribution about where he came from. And I thought I couldn't let it pass without telling you that when I moved in 1981 out of a housing commission house, I loaded up my 2 dogs, 2 goats, horse, worm farm. I took my then girlfriend out of her riverfront air-conditioned home and moved into a Bondwood caravan out on McKinnon Drive, which had no power or water. My first job was a washer-up at Rio's restaurant down near Hastings Street with Leonie Palmer as my boss. So no doubt my worldview is going to come from a view about protecting social housing, affordable housing, and protecting housing for workers. No doubt. But also, after the slump in the late 80s, early 90s, I bought management rights down at Noosaville because a company had bought up a whole lot of short stay accommodation and was dealing with it and went bankrupt when the market went down. And so I will be affected by an understanding of what the cycles do to short-term accommodation in this town and what it means to both businesses, workers, and to investors. Okay? I also own a short-term unit and a permanent rental. And I know in the global financial crisis that what happens is investors move out of short-term accommodation into permanent rental. And this is a sensible thing to do. I also know, because I've studied microeconomics and local development economics, that probably one of the worst things you can do when demand's on the downward slide is increase supply. Because what that does is drive down prices, sends more businesses bankrupt, loses more jobs, and has a perverse economic impact. So my worldview is, it is absolutely crazy to suggest we need to be increasing and making more areas open to short-term accommodation if our objective is to help our current economy, our current workers, and our current employers through what will be the most difficult economic times in 100 years. It is essential that we get this new scheme in for the very reason that 75 different types of applications are now easier, cheaper and quicker, so that businesses looking at the new economy can move quickly. I do ask councillors to reconsider their position on this, because they will be judged, because we've had the chance to vote on our differences on short term, and I perfectly accept that there's two different views, perfectly accept that the people who argued in a very strong way, in a different way to me, were representing the people that they strongly asserted during the campaign, or the values. But when we vote on the planning scheme, we're voting on the whole planning scheme. We're voting on everything that's in it, and the judgment you need to make is the community better off by adopting it as it is, or is it better off keeping the old planning scheme? I think it's really important that we do adopt this scheme, that it is appropriate to monitor the impact. After we've gone through the 12 months where people can apply under the superseded scheme, after we've maybe started to come more quickly out of a recession, that within about that 2-year period, we should have an indication whether the various settings are working, or whether they are having a positive or negative economic impact, and then it's the time to make the decision about what sort of amendments are needed. So I do think that the amendments to the original motion have good value. I do like that it focuses us onto that, yes, we're going to really keep a sharp eye and see whether the flexibility measures in our industrial areas will make a difference. It does make us focus that, yes, we do want to put a focus on social and affordable housing. And yes, we do want to put the interests of our local residents and their amenity and their lifestyles at the centre of what we do in terms of the local law. So I thank all those councillors who made those amendments. And as everyone else, both the director and all the staff behind us have done a fantastic job. Some of the amendments that have come have really changed the way that we've looked at planning in Noosa. It's always been considered that the population cap for well over 20 years has been the centre, and we've retained that. But this scheme has looked at it, the land use question, from how do we become a focus both on our economy and on housing, more so than any previous planning scheme. So I commend it on that, and I commend all the hard work done by the staff. We have some of the most experienced and diligent staff in this organisation, some that have been here for decades and still look like they're in their 20s. No. And some that have come back to the coast after experience down in the southern states. So I wholeheartedly, on behalf of Council, thank you. And because today is a day of Gandhi quotes, I found one. And it is, in a gentle way, you can shake the world.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We might vote on the very important motion before us that is on the screen.
On the recommendation, Council note the report and adopt the Noosa Plan 2020. All in favour? Against? 5-2. Yep. Thank you. That brings us to the. Oh no, it doesn't. Sorry, that's only item 1.
I don't go right off.
Wishful thinking.
Page 13 is item 2. Things that structure charges plan.
Okay. Could I? There is a recommendation on page 13 of 40. Can I have a mover for that?
I'll move it, Madam
All
Chair.
right, thank you. And seconder?
Second it.
Would anyone like to speak to this motion?
No, thank you.
No, thank you. All in favour?
Oh,
Yeah, unanimous. The last item on the agenda is page 18, and that is the Noosa Plan 2020 fees and charges for the new planning scheme. Staff recommendation. Would anyone like to move that motion?
I think I may have a question somewhere. Just be
Thank you.
checking. No, I'm right.
There's a recommendation. Would you like to move the recommendation?
I'm happy to move. I'll happily move it.
Thank you.
I'll second it,
Councillor
Madam
Second.
Chair.
Would anyone like to speak to that motion? Okay.
Just a question, on page 19, it says both, there's a superseded planning scheme fees and also current planning scheme fees in the schedule. And could you explain why we need to note both sets of fees here, please, Kim?
Sure, Councillor Wilkie. As discussed during the meeting, with adoption of this scheme, we now have a superseded planning scheme. So people are able to seek to apply for uses under the superseded planning scheme for a period of 12 months. So the two sets of fees reflect that. The fees associated with the current scheme, which are the superseded planning scheme fees, and the fees associated with the new scheme. Both of those need to be in operation for 12 months.
Can I ask a question, Kim? Why are we asking residents to pay $1,380 for a right that they already have?
Are you referring to the superseded planning scheme application?
Existing use, yeah.
So there's a process that's set out under the Planning Act where when a new scheme comes in, you have to put forward an application. It's prescribed under the Planning Act to be assessed, to request to be assessed under the superseded planning scheme. Now that's not an automatic process, that's an assessment process that's undertaken by Development Assessment that considers a range of things. So it looks at what you're proposing on the land, what the new scheme's looking for, what the old scheme considers, a range of issues. So there is an assessment process that needs to happen. So that's what the fee is for.
Yeah, I'll ask a question as well. With regard to the fee names from the previous scheme to the new scheme, I noticed that there's a raft of new fee names. I'm assuming that they have a correlation to the previous names, and I'm assuming that they come from some element of the Queensland Planning Act.
Yeah, that's correct. So the new fee names relate to the use definitions under both the Planning Act and the new Noosa Plan, and they reflect those. There is generally a translation from previous uses to new uses. That's an unfortunate thing, that when you change a Planning Act, that's what they seem to do, change the use names.
That's right. I know there are things like Air Service Major, which I assume is a major airport introduction. I don't see that happening in Noosa anytime soon, but I'm gathering that all of these are standard, standards that apply across the planning schemes for all councils based on the Planning Act, so that all councils have to adopt these fee names as a standard.
Yeah, that's right. All councils have to adopt the definitions of uses in their planning schemes set by the Act.
There's a question, yeah. With regarding to the fees for the assessment in the next 12 months, is there opportunity to waive the fees under special circumstances?
Yes, there is. I have delegation for fee waiver, and we often get applications to waive fees, reduce fees, and we go through a process of assessing that based on the circumstances. So yes, there is a process in place for that.
And just for the new councillors, those when Kim does exercise that delegation, there's a report to council every 4 months, 5 months?
Yeah, sort of every quarter.
Every couple of months about what fees have been waived and why.
Yeah.
So that comes to council for information as well.
Thank you.
And just in relation to those fees, has there been any change of the fee structures with the corresponding fee names across the board? From my reading of it, there is little that has changed. It's just a transition from one name to another. But have there been any fee changes through the adoption of the new plan?
Essentially not, other than names.
Thank you.
There may be one or two new uses that weren't under the previous, where there would be a new fee, but essentially no.
Thank you.
Just a question, and it probably relates back to the superseded applications under the application for a superseded planning scheme. But more generally, under the Act, we are required to set fees so it just meets the cost of assessment. Is that right? That we're just meeting basically the staff cost to assess and transact that?
Yeah, there's provisions that we have to have what's called cost recovery, so we can't run under profit, but we can't subsidise as well. So full cost recovery is the terminology that's used.
And just to follow up on that, so when we're looking at the waivers, it's about the particular circumstance of the application, which may mean that the assessment costs would be less than what the full cost recovery would need. Is that the sort of there are specific grounds which they have to comply with, so maybe if you could just give us an explanation of that.
Yeah, sure, and Kerry can step in if she wants to. Yeah, absolutely. If we get a request for a fee waiver, it's usually a reduction in a fee or a 25% because based on the circumstances, that it might be a minor application, what we do is we look at it and we consider what the assessment process would be. And if it's the normal assessment process where it involves, the planner, the engineer, potentially a third party, then we don't tend to waive the fee. But if we look at it and go, they provided all the right information, it is a minor aspect. Yeah, there is some merit for. It's not going to take us as long. So there's a process that we go through to assess those, absolutely, on a case by case basis.
Thank you. Is there anyone else?
No, I think the questions have answered everything that I've had. I don't think there's anything that needs to be said.
Lovely, thank you. Might vote. All in favour? 6-1.
So you call against as well? So
Against? 1 against. Yeah, 6-1. That brings.
Just before we close, can I just add to the councillors' comments before to thank the staff? I really want to thank Kim, all the strategic planning team for the great work you've done over the last 4 years. It's been a roller coaster at times, but your professionalism and dedication is second to none. Really proud of what you've done over that period. So well done. Thank you.
Thank you.
And if someone wants to talk for 2 minutes, Kim gets the one.
Just see if I can do it. There are no further items on our agenda, but I can make some. I'd like to close our meeting, but I would like to thank this very special meeting for the adoption of the Noosa plan, and I'd like to thank all councillors. And what I think is a really nice thing about this council is we can have a robust debate and leave it at the table, which I think is a great thing. I'd like to thank Kim and all the staff. I bet you guys are going to breathe a big sigh of relief this evening, and thank you for everyone who's in attendance. This has been a big thing, so it's a big day for all of us. So thank you. Good afternoon.
Thank you, Madam Chair.